Now, last week it was announced that Season 2 of the animated show Star Wars Resistance would be its last, which I'd have to imagine wasn't the original game plan, lasting just 2 seasons, I mean. Instead, they likely envisioned this show going for many, many more years, and maybe even ending up becoming something like the Clone Wars animated series, that being a show that was sandwiched between 2 episodes of a trilogy, and went into stories and explored characters in greater depth than the movies ever had time for, a show that essentially bridged the gap between 2 films. Or at least that's what I'd assume it was going to do. I guess we'll never know now. I'd assume it was meant to show us how the Resistance picked itself up after the events of The Last Jedi, when they were literally left with like a dozen members. Because when the rise of Skywalker starts up, the Resistance will almost undoubtedly be back to full strength. They'll suddenly have a force that can now go toe-to-toe with the First Order, and is looking for a way to probably achieve some sort of final victory over them. And at most, to explain how they rose from the ashes The Last Jedi left them in, we'll get a line or two about how Luke's last stand on Crate inspired people to join up and fight the First Order, that many of the systems didn't just lay down and let themselves be conquered, they decided to fight instead. And what the show Resistance would have eventually done, I'm guessing, was show us how that all actually happened or played out. And it wouldn't have surprised me in the least if we would have seen more out of characters like Poe and Leia, who we did see a bit in the first season, and even characters like Rey and Finn as the show went on. And let's be honest here, that sounds like a great idea, especially when you consider the decision to make this show would have been made before The Last Jedi ever hit theaters, because it takes quite a bit of time, a good year start to finish, to produce an entire 20-some episode season of one of these animated shows. And so when you factor in that Season 1 of Resistance aired like 8 or 9 months after The Last Jedi hit theaters, it means work on it had begun long before that movie actually ever came out, when likely everyone at Lucasfilm was assuming, after the success of The Force Awakens, that The Last Jedi would resonate with all fans and the sequel trilogy era would be on its way to becoming the next great time period in Star Wars. However, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that doesn't seem to be happening, like poor attendance at Galaxy's Edge, which is based off the sequel trilogy time period, the slumping sales of Star Wars toys, many of which are based off the sequel trilogy, and the fact that Resistance essentially only lasted 1 season. And I say that because work on Season 2 of the show would have begun even before Season 1 aired. Again, keep in mind how long it takes to make these shows. In other words, Lucasfilm didn't know how poorly Season 1 was going to do until after work on Season 2 had long since started. And it'll be very curious to see how many episodes are actually going to be in Season 2. Because if we're only getting something like a dozen episodes, it'll mean we're only getting half of what would have originally been planned, likely only up to what would have been the mid-season finale originally. It'll basically mean that while Season 1 was airing, they realized that they had a dud on their hands and wrapped up production on Season 2 before they finished it. Which might actually be good news, depending on your point of view, because the sooner production on Resistance ended, the sooner they could start figuring out and working on whatever would come next. Because I don't think the failure of Resistance means that Lucasfilm will give up on animation altogether. That would be foolish. We need only look at the hype around Season 7 of the Clone Wars to see how much fans can and will fall in love with great Star Wars animation. And if anything here, I hope the failure of Resistance will help Lucasfilm re-examine their approach with animation, realizing that aiming these shows squarely at children instead of a broader audience doesn't work all that well. Neither does skimping on the production budget, because there were a lot of fans that just couldn't get into this show, or didn't even give it a chance because of its childish nature and the lower quality of animation, which Lucasfilm has tried to pass off as anime-inspired. Okay, so what's next here? Where does Lucasfilm go with their next animated show? Well, I don't think we're going to go back to the sequel trilogy era again anytime soon, or maybe even ever with an animated show. I know this won't be a popular opinion with those who do love the time period, but once the rise of Skywalker has come and gone, I don't see Lucasfilm doing very much with this time period in the future because, flat out, it just doesn't seem to be selling. And so, with the next animated show, they'll go back to what they know does sell, that being Ahsoka Tano. I'd have to imagine what we'll eventually get next is a show about Ahsoka and Sabine's quest to find Ezra out there somewhere in the uncharted parts of the galaxy. A show that would likely also include Thrawn and the Chiss Ascendancy. Basically, it'll pick up where the Rebels series finale left off. And quite obviously, I think it was always the game plan to come back to that storyline at some point in the future, probably after Resistance had wrapped up a long multi-season run. And what could be very cool about such a show is it can still have its roots in the familiar while also reaching out and exploring the new and unknown, For example, maybe Ahsoka and Sabine eventually find Ezra in a very distant part of the galaxy, one that's never even heard of the Jedi before, one that's ruled by dark side users that are like the Sith, or maybe even some sort of offshoot of them. And Ezra has been there for the past several years now, trying to secretly train up an order of Jedi to fight against them. And then with Ahsoka's help, he could obviously train them much quicker and more efficiently. Problem is, Ahsoka doesn't consider herself a Jedi anymore, so she'd have to decide if she should take up the title once more, or if maybe a different destiny altogether awaits her. And in this far-off part of the galaxy, maybe she and we learn more about such things as the Bendu or the Mortis gods, or some new aspect of the Force entirely. The possibilities with such a show in a new part of the galaxy would be endless. Another idea for a new show is to center around Luke in the time period between episodes 6 and 7, one where he is building the new Jedi Order and training Ben, and this could give much needed context to episode 8 and show how things went oh so wrong for Luke. Though quite frankly, I know a lot of fans out there have little to no interest in them ever trying to explain the way Luke was in that movie. They just don't want to buy it no matter what, and I can certainly understand that. Nevertheless, we will no doubt get a lot more about Luke in this time period, and the story of what happened between him and Ben will get told somewhere, so why not in an animated series? And other than those two ideas, I really don't know where you go next with a new animated show. Not saying there isn't a ton of possibilities and ideas for one, only that after the failure of Resistance, they'll likely want to play it safe and put together something that they know will be a hit. Though, no matter what they do come up with, I guarantee you it'll include Force users this time. Because love or hate Resistance, I found it odd that they made a show that didn't include any of them, that it was more or less this generic spy cartoon that also included racing, though it never really focused on that despite how much that seemed to be pushed in the first trailer. To me, Season 1 of Resistance was a show that was trying to set up a different show down the road, one that, like I was talking about earlier, would have probably become more focused on the actual Resistance, hence the name of the show. And let's be real here, not putting Force users in a Star Wars animated show aimed primarily at kids is like not putting loads of sugar in a cereal aimed at kids. You're not using the ingredient that's going to appeal the most and hook children. The Force is the one thing that Star Wars has over anything else out there, and it's fine if you don't want to use it extensively in a show aimed at adults like The Mandalorian will be, which, as far as we know, will have no Force users at all. But it's another when you're trying to draw the interest of kids and you don't use the magical aspect of Star Wars, when you instead give them a relatively boring spy show where the main character poses as a mechanic and you mix in little bits of racing here and there. Simply put, kids want cool characters wielding lightsabers, not bumbling idiots wielding wrenches. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think the next animated show will be. Will we see the return of Ahsoka? Will she and Sabine be going after Ezra? Or maybe we'll get the story of Luke's Jedi Order. Or will it be something different altogether? Let me know what you think in the comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.